My newest yarn in the store is a 100% Vermont Shetland. And as soon as I said that word Shetland, I'm sure all of you immediately had some picture of an association you have with what Shetland means, whether it is the Shetland Islands, those hardy, windswept islands up there between the North Sea and North Atlantic, or whether it's the typical Fair Isle patterning that we associate with Fair Isle knitting, or perhaps if you're a lace knitter, you immediately thought about the wedding ring shawls that are knit from the Shetland cobweb lace. Or maybe a particular brand of yarn that you've used that you associate with being a Shetland yarn. Well, there are a lot of misconceptions about what that term Shetland yarn means. I myself held some of these misconceptions until recently. So just because I really want to be sure you understand what it is that I'm offering here in my Shetland, I wanted to review what Shetland yarn can mean in the context of a yarn. So the first thing is we'll sort of go back to the origins, which of course are the Shetland Islands, and on these windswept islands there are hardy sheep, the origin of which, if you go back over 1,000 years, is of some debate. But generally, if you look at the inhabitants, the sheep inhabitants of some of the neighboring islands, they tend to be Soay or North Ronaldsay sheep. So the Shetland were likely of a similar type of heritage. But then they've been influenced over the years as the Vikings went eastward and brought with them Scandinavian sheep, and as the Romans marched northward and brought with them their Roman sheep, there were other genes that got introduced to the original island breed. So the Shetland sheep that are there now today are actually quite diverse, and partly that's also because in the last couple of 100 years there have been pressures to either breed sheep for more meat production or in other years for more wool production. So there's been a lot of introduction of other genetics to the original Shetland sheep. So even the Shetland sheep there that are on the Shetland Islands today have quite a smorgasbord of types of fleeces on them, and there is some debate about what a true Shetland is at this point, but a registered Shetland has certain characteristics, again, of which are still debated, but basically there are 11 different colors that they can be, and they also can exhibit different patterns or markings on their body and face, and there can be as many as 30 different patterns. So even within the breed, as you can see from the picture here, which I shot at one of the farms here in Vermont where I purchased the Shetland fiber for this yarn, there's quite a range of colors in the sheep, and here's another larger range of colors shown, but again there are 11 in total. I'm offering 8 here because I was unable to find a couple of them in enough quantity to actually have enough yarn spun up for the shop. But anyway, so the sheep, there is a sheep called the Shetland sheep that originated in the Shetland Islands, but other breeds have been introduced to the Shetland Islands in the intervening years, again because they're either trying to produce greater wool or greater meat. So this is a cone of Jamieson and Smith Shetland. Jamieson and Smith is the wool broker up there in Lerwick, and this is probably what most traditional knitters think of as being the penultimate Shetland wool, because it's from the Shetland Islands and from the wool broker there in Lerwick. And but what I discovered recently is that this is called Shetland wool because of its place of origin, which is the Shetland Islands. However, the fleeces that go into making it don't have to be from the Shetland sheep. Now, it's true that they probably are predominantly Shetland sheep, but what Jamieson and Smith does is pull wool from a pool there on the Shetland Islands, and since there are other sheep there in the Shetland Islands, not just Shetland sheep, this wool actually isn't 100% Shetland sheep wool. It is 100% from the Shetland Islands. So I'm not in any way trying to malign this yarn. It's a great yarn. I'm just trying to clarify what Shetland means when you're talking about Shetland yarn from Jamieson and Smith. Its place of origin is what gives its title, not necessarily that it's pure Shetland fleece. Now, it probably is a majority of it, but it isn't necessarily 100% Shetland fleece. Okay, so then we have another whole range of yarns, of which this is an example. And again, I'm not in any way maligning this yarn. I stock it in the store and I love working with it. comes in a great range of colors, particularly if you want to do some Fair Isle patterning for mittens or hats or sweaters. This is Harrisville's, and they call it New England Shetland, which I realize you can't read there because my UPC code has covered it, but they call it New England Shetland, and it is 100% wool, but it's not from wool from the Shetland Islands, nor is it even wool from Shetland sheep. There may be some Shetland in there, but I know when I've spoken to them in the past about what breeds go into making their yarn, I know a good portion of it is actually merino. The reason they call it Shetland is because it mimics the Shetland style. So it's a Shetland style wool. And what I mean by that, and what they mean by that, is that the yarn that's typical of the Shetland Islands is this very fine 2-ply. It's typically knit at like 7 stitches to the inch on like a US 3 needle. And they spun it this fine because they were often in their patterns working 2 strands in a row to create these wonderful designs. And they also tend to make a very heathery yarn. So they're very complex, and they offer a lot of colors that are subtly changing in the range of hues so that you can create really beautiful and complex patterns, color patterns. So that's considered sort of a Shetland style. I mean, these are the sort of trademarks of what people associate with a Shetland yarn. Fine gauge, 7 to the inch on a 3, 2-ply, and heathery tones. So not that it has to be. The yarn that my sister used to knit this came from the Shetland Islands, actually from Jamieson and Smith, and it is their cobweb lace, so this happens to be a 1-ply. But the Shetland that is used for the typical Fair Isle patterns is this 2-ply jumper weight, I think they refer to it there. So this yarn calls itself the New England Shetland, not because it's Shetland wool and not because it comes from the Shetland Islands, but because it's in a Shetland style. So it's about 7 stitches to the inch on a US 3. All the tones are lovely and heathery, and it's really well suited to doing these typical Fair Isle sorts of designs. So that's another yarn that's called Shetland, and yet has nothing necessarily to do with the Shetland sheep. So the wool that I have here from Vermont is actually 100% Shetland sheep's wool. So obviously it's not from the Shetland Islands because I gathered it from various farms around the state of Vermont. Here's some pictures of some of them just to show you the range of colors of the Shetland sheep and also some of the places from which I gathered it. Here are a bunch of the fleeces just in the back room here when I was trying to sort them because I had to group fleeces to get the color range here. And as I said, if you look at the Shetland registry, they acknowledge or recognize 11 distinct colors, natural colors of Shetland wool, and I was aiming for that, but some of the colors actually are pretty hard to find, and particularly in quantity. So I've ended up with 8 gorgeous colors here, but it took quite a while to figure out how I was going to pool them because I was worried about getting enough distinction that the colors were different, and yet you want them to be close so that you can do the beautiful grading that's so typical of the Shetland products or knitted traditions. So that's the difference again. A Shetland wool can be called Shetland because legally and accurately, and there's nothing wrong with it, but just so you know again, it can be called Shetland because of its place of origin, even though it isn't necessarily 100% Shetland wool from the Shetland sheep. It is from wool from the Shetland Islands, which can include other breeds. Again, not a bad thing, just a distinction. It can be called a Shetland wool because it's in the Shetland style of being 7 to the inch, 2-ply, and beautiful heathery tones. Or it can be wool that's raised somewhere else in the world because Shetland sheep have now been brought into many other countries and states, including Vermont. So it can be 100% Shetland wool from the Shetland sheep, but raised in Vermont. And that's what I'm offering here in these 8 colors. And the hand of it is quite different. I also did ask to have it spun at a typical gauge for knitting Shetland because I thought it would be wonderful for people who wanted to work with all natural colors to do some Fair Isle designs with all 8 or some portion of them if they wanted. And so I wanted that gauge. So it is 7 to the inch on a 3. But it is just so incredibly soft, so much softer than some of the other Shetland wools. And the reason for that is, let me just fast forward here to a couple of other pictures. Here's a sample of two of the fleeces that went into making this yarn up close. And the reason I point this out is, first of all, because I gathered from various farms, and it's up to the farmer to decide when a lamb is born whether they're a Myoget or an Emskid or a Shayla or a Morit, etc., based on what their understanding of the colors is. So here are two different fleeces from different farms, both called fawn, but you can see how different the color is. And I apologize, trying to shoot from a TV screen to the video, you're probably not getting the best color resolution, but these are both beautiful browns, but this one is a much redder, darker brown, and this is a grayer brown, and yet the two different farms both considered this fleece a fawn colored. So first of all, you can see there's variation from person to person because it's a subjective call, what is fawn. So the second thing I'm hoping that you can see is that the lock structure is quite different looking at both of these fleeces. This one has quite a bit of crimp in it. There's a lot of crimp here, whereas this one has very little crimp and almost straight. And the point I wanted to make by showing this, aside from the color variation, is that there is a wide range of styles of Shetland wool off the Shetland sheep now, and that comes from all the introduction of different genes over the years, and also different breeders, of course, are trying to select for different qualities in their breeds. So there are some Shetland fleeces that are called dual coated. They have the two coats that go back historically to the original Shetland sheep. They have, let me see if I can show this a little bit better. This is a lock from a dual coated Shetland sheep. And you can see that there's a finer, softer undercoat up here, but then there is also this quite hairy, longer coat. So the downy underpart kept them warm, and this outer second coat, which is very coarse and hairy, helped repel some water and some of the elements from living in those harsh conditions. So a lot of Shetland sheep have the dual coat. But other breeders have taken the Shetland sheep and bred that out and are producing a fiber or sheep that produce wool that is only single coated. So it doesn't have the long, hairy second coat that some of the original sheep have. So here's another. You can see these have a little bit, they don't have the second coat, so they're single coated. So they are lacking that really coarse fiber, and they're a little bit crimpier, and some even get even more crimpier. So there's a wide variation in Shetland sheep genetics out there. And that's the last point I wanted to make, is that because I went around and I hand selected and looked at every single fleece and picked and culled what I wanted in my yarn, I have single coated fleeces here, not the dual coated, so there's none of the coarse fiber that some of the Shetland fleeces have and which could get incorporated into other Shetland yarn. It's really just the very soft, fine coats that I chose to go into my yarn. So again, there's absolutely nothing wrong with a Shetland style yarn or the original Jameson and Smith, but they are different from what I'm offering here, and that's, I guess, really the only point I wanted to make, because it was news to me that this wasn't 100% Shetland fleece from the Shetland sheep. It's really based on the place of origin. I've always known that this is in the Shetland style and what that distinction meant, but this was a new one to me, so I just kind of wanted to share that with you, because there is a huge difference in the hand of these fleeces, of these skeins of yarn. And also I think there's quite a bit more luster in the 100% Shetland sheep's wool that I'm offering here. It's and you may not be able to pick that up on the video here, but it's just, it's lovely, it's lofty, it's soft. You definitely could wear it next to the skin. I certainly could. I mean, maybe some people who are very sensitive couldn't, but I didn't want those of you who have maybe worked with a scratchier Shetland wool to jump to conclusions about this Vermont Shetland, because that